Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we've got a wildly fascinating and honestly pretty sobering case study to dig into. We are going to dissect the official Directorate General of Civil Aviation, or DGCA, accident report for a Cessna 152 aircraft registration VT-ACC. And look, this is a story that goes way, way beyond a simple mechanical failure. It's actually this profound look into human psychology, rule breaking, and the incredibly thin line between a totally routine training flight and absolute disaster. So here is the ultimate question we need to answer today. Think about this. How does a perfectly maintained aircraft, flown in clear weather by a qualified pilot, end up completely upside down in a river? You know, when aviation investigators show up at a crash site, the very first suspects are almost always the machine itself or the environment. But in this specific case, mechanical failure and weather conditions were completely and definitively ruled out right from the jump. The engine was humming perfectly, the flight controls worked exactly as designed, and the skies were clear. So, if the plane was perfect and the weather was perfect, how on earth did it end up at the bottom of a river? Well, to understand that, we need to rewind to the morning of March 14, 2008 at the Baramati airstrip operated by Carver Aviation. The conditions that day were absolutely pristine. We're talking a gentle 6-knot breeze, 8 kilometers of visibility, beautiful clear skies. The aircraft, which was a super reliable 29-year-old Cessna 152, had already completed 4 totally uneventful training sorties that exact same morning. 0 reported snags. Basically, it was just another completely routine, totally boring day of flight training. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, it must have been a terrified, completely inexperienced rookie at the controls. Actually, scratch that assumption entirely. With 275 hours and 15 minutes of total flying experience, the 23-year-old pilot in command was no beginner. He already held a valid private pilot license, he logged 195 hours as pilot in command specifically on this exact type of aircraft, and he had even completed enough hours to get his commercial pilot license. He knew this aircraft inside and out, and he absolutely knew how to fly. Section 1. The Deviations. Okay, let's dive into this, because this is exactly where our completely routine morning takes a really dark turn. The official report outlines a sequence of deliberate human errors that kicked off a deadly chain reaction. Because this wasn't just one simple mistake, It was a cascade of conscious choices to break standard operating procedures. First up, the pilot totally bypassed the chief flight instructor and secretly snuck another student pilot aboard as a passenger. The tarmac was restricted, and the instructor was off in his room signing other authorizations. Second, to cover up that little secret, the pilot straight up lied to air traffic control during the takeoff clearance, telling them he was the only person on board. And third, after being cleared to fly south of the airfield at a very specific, safe altitude, he just decided to completely ignore that assignment. Every single one of these steps was a consciously broken aviation rule that stripped away a critical layer of safety. The timeline here builds some incredible tension when you look at the stark contrast between what was being said over the radio and what was actually going down in the air. At 0530 UTC, the flight takes off totally normally. 50 minutes later, at 0620 UTC, the pilot radios ATC to report he's established south of the airfield at 3,500 feet and casually states, all operations normal. The controller tells him, okay, report back every 10 minutes. But he never does, because literally just 7 minutes later at 0627 UTC, a local police station gets a frantic call reporting that an aircraft has just plunged into the Nera River. Section 2. The Investigations Reveal. So what the heck actually happened in that deadly 7-minute window between a super calm radio call and a catastrophic crash? Well, investigators found a massive physical discrepancy, and this brilliantly illustrates the core issue. ATC had assigned him an altitude of 3,500 feet above mean sea level. That translates to a very safe 1,500 feet above ground level. But the investigators uncovered a terrifying reality. The pilot had intentionally descended to a dangerously low 50 feet above the Nera River. The DGCA report actually includes the pilot's direct confession, and honestly, it is chilling in its simplicity. Quote, I actually started descending from the assigned altitude of 3,500 feet to do low flying over the river for fun. Wow, I really want the weight of those words to sink in for a second. For fun. A fully qualified pilot, completely responsible for a passenger's life, traded 1,500 feet of safety margin just for the thrill of skimming the water. Section 3. The Anatomy of the Crash. Listen, when you're flying at 50 feet off the deck, your margin for error isn't measured in minutes anymore. It is literally measured in milliseconds. Let's break down the rapid sensory overload happening in that cockpit during those final seconds before impact. At 50 feet over the river, the pilot's visual field instantly narrowed. According to his own testimony, he knew there was a bridge up ahead crossing the river standing about 100 feet tall. So his entire cognitive bandwidth became completely fixated on that single obstacle. He was totally focused on preparing to aggressively pull the aircraft up and over that looming concrete structure.
But the environment was actively working against him here. The aircraft was flying east. That meant the intense glare of the morning sun was shining directly into the pilot's eyes, striking the windshield and just flooding the cockpit with blinding light. This intense glare absolutely destroyed his visual spatial awareness, completely masking the details in the landscape rushing toward him.
And because of that blinding sun, and because his brain was 100% fixated on that 100-foot bridge, he completely missed the trap laid out right in front of him. Running directly across the river, just before the bridge, were high-tension electric cables suspended at exactly 50 feet. Yep, the exact altitude the Cessna was currently skimming the river.
So the absolutely crucial point to take away from this is how all these random elements stacked up. This is just a textbook manifestation of the Swiss cheese model. If you aren't familiar, it's the idea that multiple independent failures have to perfectly align to cause a disaster. The unauthorized passenger, the lied ATC, the unauthorized descent, the blinding sun, the target fixation, all these independent failures and deviations lined up perfectly. If just one defensive layer had held up, the wires wouldn't have even mattered. But they all aligned. By the time the pilot actually noticed those cables through the glare, it was way too late. He desperately yanked back on the controls, but the brutal physics of a wire strike took over. The fixed main landing gear of the Cessna violently entangled with the high-tension cables. The force of it was so immense that the tail section literally broke, the right wingtips smashed, and the entire aircraft was violently flipped upside down, crashing directly into the waters of the Nera River.
Section 4. The Miraculous Aftermath. Okay, normally, an aircraft crashing upside down into a river after tangling with high-tension electrical cables ends in absolute unmitigated tragedy. But in a seriously jaw-dropping stroke of luck, the pilot and his passenger didn't just survive the physical impact, they survived the wires. Why? Because at the exact moment of the accident, the local village was experiencing a power cut. There was absolutely zero electricity running through those high-tension cables when the metal landing gear wrapped around them. If the power had been on, the occupants would have almost certainly faced instant electrocution. Instead, local villagers who witnessed the crash from the bridge jumped right into the river and rescued both occupants, who ended up walking away with just minor injuries. Crazy, right? Now, obviously, surviving by pure luck doesn't mean you escape accountability. The final DGCA report laid down some very strict recommendations. They advised taking appropriate action against the pilot in command for his intentional low flying and that unauthorized passenger. But importantly, they looked at the systemic level too. They recommended enhanced surveillance at training institutes to actively monitor flying activities and strongly discourage these kind of thrill rides. They also mandated a full audit of Carver Aviation's operational procedures to ensure tarmac security. And this really matters, because safety rules aren't just annoying bureaucracy, they are literally written in blood, or I guess in this incredibly rare case, written in river water. Which leaves us with this final thought. VT-ACC wasn't brought down by a failing engine or a freak storm. It was brought down by human nature. When the routine, everyday nature of a highly structured environment meets that irresistible thrill of breaking the rules for just a moment of fun, we really have to ask ourselves, how close are we actually flying to the edge of disaster? It's a stark reminder that in aviation, just like in life, discipline is the ultimate safety net. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what's just beneath the surface. Catch you next time.